The wind howled through the dense forest as Willow limped forward, her fox-like ears twitching at every rustling sound. The pain in her ankle burned like fire, but she couldn't stop now, not when she had finally escaped. She had spent her whole life hiding. The shame, the whispers, the way her family's eyes avoided hers, it had all told her she didn't belong. The only one with golden furred ears and a swishing tail among humans who wanted nothing to do with her. Her mother had tried to love her, but even she couldn't meet Willow's gaze without sadness in her eyes. It was as if her very existence was a burden. So she had run. The thick underbrush had made it hard to navigate, and in her desperation she had tripped over a gnarled root, twisting her ankle painfully. Now she was stranded, alone and shivering. The moonlight filtered through the leaves above, casting eerie shadows around her. She swallowed hard, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Then she heard it. A rustle too heavy to be the wind. Panic flared in her chest as she struggled to sit up, her ears flattening against her head. A figure emerged from the trees, tall and dark, his presence commanding yet strangely calm. His hair was raven black, tousled by the wind, and his sharp eyes gleamed under the pale moonlight. His clothes were simple, but he moved with an effortless grace that sent a shiver down her spine. Willow tried to scramble away, but her injured ankle gave out, and she collapsed with a small cry. The man raised his hands in a slow, non-threatening motion. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said, his voice deep yet soothing. "I saw you fall. You're injured." She clenched her jaw, staring at him with wide, frightened eyes. She had been told humans were cruel. Even though he was undeniably handsome, she couldn't let her guard down. But when he took another step, she realized something. His scent was not entirely human. It was faint, but there, something wild lingering beneath the surface. "Let me help you," he said gently, crouching down in front of her. She hesitated, heart hammering against her ribs, but something in his gaze, warm, patient, made the fear in her chest loosen just a little. "Fine," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He nodded and moved closer, his touch surprisingly gentle as he examined her ankle. She winced but didn't pull away. The warmth of his hands seeped through her, grounding her in the moment. "I'm Lucas," he murmured as he began wrapping a strip of cloth around her ankle. "And you're not as alone as you think." Willow's eyes flickered to his, a question forming on her lips, but she held it back. For now, she allowed herself to trust, just a little, as the forest whispered around them and the night embraced them both. Lucas carried her to a small cottage nestled between ancient oaks, their branches forming a protective canopy above. Inside, the warmth of a dying fire greeted them, along with simple furnishings that spoke of a solitary life. Herbs hung from the rafters, filling the air with earthy scents of rosemary, sage, and something sweeter. Willow couldn't identify. Weathered books lined a small shelf, their spines cracked with use, while various glass bottles containing liquids of amber, emerald, and sapphire hues lined a wooden workbench in the corner. He set her down gently on a worn chair covered with a patchwork quilt and busied himself with stoking the flames. The fire's renewed warmth reached across the room, chasing away the chill that had seeped into Willow's bones. "You live here? Alone?" Willow asked, her golden eyes taking in every detail, from the hand-carved wooden spoons hanging near the hearth to the peculiar crystalline figurines decorating the windowsill, each catching the firelight in hypnotic patterns. Lucas nodded, his back to her as he hung a small copper kettle over the flames. "For the past 5 years, it's peaceful." His voice held a note of contentment, yet Willow detected something else, a familiar loneliness, perhaps. "No one bothers you out here?" she pressed, finding it difficult to believe someone could exist so completely removed from judgment. As he turned, firelight danced across his features, illuminating what the moonlight had concealed, a thin scar running from his temple to his jaw, its silvery line contrasting against his olive skin. But it wasn't the scar that caught Willow's attention. It was the subtle point to his ears, almost imperceptible unless one knew to look. She began, her voice trailing off, afraid to name what she was seeing in case she was wrong, in case this small spark of kinship was merely wishful thinking. Lucas smiled, a hint of sadness in his eyes as he poured steaming water into a clay mug, adding dried leaves that immediately released a calming aroma. "Half-elven. Not enough to be welcomed by the elves, too much to be accepted by humans." His gaze fell to her fox ears, a knowing look passing between them. "We're not so different, you and I." He handed her the tea, their fingers brushing momentarily. "This will help with the pain." Something unspoken passed between them, a recognition that went beyond words, the silent understanding of two beings who had never quite belonged anywhere. "I'm Willow," she finally offered, realizing she hadn't introduced herself. The tea warmed her hands, its steam curling like spectral fingers in the dim light. "Like the tree," Lucas observed, settling into a chair across from her. "Flexible, resilient, thriving near water that others find too wild." There was appreciation in his voice, as though the name itself revealed something essential about her character. Willow smiled despite herself. No one had ever spoken of her name with such consideration. "And Lucas? What does your name mean?" "Lightbringer," he replied with a self-deprecating chuckle. "My mother had high hopes." "Did she?" Willow didn't miss the past tense, the subtle shift in his expression. Lucas's gaze turned distant. She believed mixed blood would bring understanding between worlds. He gestured vaguely toward the window, toward the vast forest beyond. She was optimistic. Over the next few days, as her ankle healed under Lucas's attentive care, Willow learned more about him. Fragments offered in quiet conversations by firelight, small revelations during walks through the surrounding woods as she tested her strengthening limb. He was a healer, gathering herbs from the forest, and occasionally venturing to nearby villages to help those who couldn't afford city physicians. The villagers tolerated him, grateful for his skills, but keeping their distance, accepting his remedies with one hand while making warding gestures behind his back with the other. Lucas showed her his garden, where plants both common and rare grew in careful rows. He taught her their names, their properties, which could heal and which could harm. His hands, always gentle, would brush leaves aside to reveal hidden blooms, explaining each with the reverence of someone who saw magic in the ordinary. "This one," he said one afternoon, kneeling beside a cluster of unassuming white flowers, "can calm the most troubled mind." His fingers grazed the delicate petals. "But if prepared incorrectly, it brings nightmares that can drive one to madness." Willow crouched beside him, careful not to crush the plants with her tail. "How did you learn all this?" A shadow passed over his face. "Trial and error. Books," and he hesitated, "my father, before he died." "Your elven father?" Willow asked softly. Lucas nodded, rising to his feet. "He taught me what he could before the Elven Council declared my existence an affront to their bloodline." His voice was matter of fact, the old wound long scarred over. "They gave him a choice, abandon me and my mother, or leave the Elven realms forever." "He chose you," Willow said, not a question, but a statement of understanding. "He did." Lucas's expression softened. "We had 10 years together before a human mob, fearful of his pointed ears and strange ways, decided the world would be safer without him." Willow's heart constricted. The story was too familiar, fear turning to hatred, hatred to violence. "I'm sorry." Lucas shrugged, but the casual gesture couldn't disguise the pain beneath. "It was long ago." "Why help them?" Willow asked one evening as they shared a meal of rabbit stew, rich with forest mushrooms and wild carrots. The question had been building in her for days. "When they treat you like an outsider? When they took your father from you?" Lucas considered this, his fingers absently tracing the rim of his wooden bowl. Steam rose between them, carrying the savory scent of their dinner. Outside, an owl called into the gathering dusk. "Because healing is who I am, not what others think of me," he finally replied, his eyes meeting hers across the table. "Their fear doesn't define me. And perhaps," he paused, searching for words, "perhaps in healing their bodies, someday their minds might follow." His words settled into her heart like stones in a still pond, creating ripples she couldn't ignore. Willow thought of her own flight, her desperate need to escape the whispers and stares. Had she been running from them or from herself? "What about you?" Lucas asked, breaking into her thoughts. "Where were you running from when I found you?" Willow stared into her stew, watching the steam rise and dissipate. "A village called Marrowvale." The name felt strange on her tongue after so long. "My mother, she fell in love with a forest spirit, or so the village gossip went. He disappeared before I was born." She gestured to her fox ears, leaving these as proof of his visit. Lucas listened without interruption, his gaze steady and free of judgment. She tried, Willow continued, surprising herself with the admission. My mother, she defended me against the worst accusations, kept me fed and clothed when many suggested I be left in the forest for the wolves. A bitter smile twisted her lips, but every time she looked at me I could see the shame, the regret. So you left, Lucas supplied gently. Willow nodded, her throat tight. 3 nights ago, I couldn't bear it anymore, being the village monster, the cautionary tale mothers tell their daughters. Her hands clenched around her spoon. I thought I'd find others like me, somewhere I'd belong. Lucas reached across the table, his fingers closing around hers. Perhaps you have, he said quietly. The moment hung between them, fragile as a soap bubble. Willow felt something shift inside her, a crack in the wall she'd built around her heart. One morning, as dawn's first light filtered through the cottage windows, painting the humble interior in shades of gold and amber, a frantic knocking at the door startled them both. Lucas opened it to find a haggard man, desperation etched on his weather-worn face. His clothes were travel-stained, his eyes red-rimmed from exhaustion or tears. Perhaps both. Healer, the man gasped, swaying slightly on his feet as though he might collapse at any moment. The sickness has returned to the village. Children are dying. The fever, it's taking them so quickly this time. His voice broke. My own daughter, she burns like fire yet shivers with cold. Please. Lucas didn't hesitate, already moving to gather his supplies. Dried herbs, tinctures, clean bandages all disappearing into a worn leather satchel. I'll come immediately. He turned to Willow, his expression grave. This could be dangerous. You should stay here. But Willow, her ankle now mostly healed, shook her head. The man's desperation stirred something in her. A need to help, to be useful, to prove that her differences could be a strength rather than a shame. I'm coming with you. 2 pairs of hands will work faster than one. Lucas studied her face for a moment, then nodded, handing her a smaller bag to pack. We'll need clean water, lots of it. And these. He pointed to bundles of mint and feverfew hanging from the rafters, as many as you can fit. The village was small, just a cluster of humble homes surrounded by fields of early wheat and barley. A stone well stood at its center, and an apple orchard spread to the east, the trees just beginning to blossom with delicate pink flowers. As they approached, walking briskly behind the anxious father, Willow pulled her cloak tighter, ensuring the hood concealed her ears and her tail remained hidden beneath the folds of fabric. The fear of rejection, of hatred, was a deep-rooted instinct she couldn't shake. Yet something about the village nagged at her memory. The specific curve of the road, the weathered statue of a forgotten deity near the well, the distinctive slope of the thatched roofs. A creeping suspicion formed in her mind, but she pushed it aside, focusing instead on the task at hand. The scene that greeted them was grim. Inside the first home, pale-faced children lay in fever-induced sleep, their small forms shivering despite being wrapped in blankets. Parents hovered nearby with tear-streaked faces, hope flaring in their eyes as Lucas entered. None spared more than a cursory glance for Willow, too concerned with their children's fate to question the healer's companion. Lucas moved from bed to bed, examining each child with careful precision, checking pupils, feeling for swollen glands, listening to labored breathing. His expression grew more troubled with each patient. It's the same as last winter, he murmured to Willow as they stepped outside for a moment, the cool air a relief after the stifling heat of the sick room. A fever that starts mild but grows rapidly, accompanied by a rash on the palms and soles. Last time we lost 3 children before I found a remedy. What do you need? Willow asked, determination replacing her earlier trepidation. Lucas described a rare flower that grew near the base of the mountains, a day's journey away. Blue moondrops. They bloom only at night, with 5 petals that seem to glow in the darkness. Their petals, when brewed correctly, can break even the most stubborn fever, but there isn't time to reach them and return before. I'll go, Willow said firmly, already calculating the fastest route through the forest. I'm faster than any human, especially through the woods. I can be there by nightfall, gather the flowers, and return by morning. Lucas's protest died on his lips as he saw the resolve in her eyes. Instead, he squeezed her hand, his fingers warm against hers. Be careful, the mountains have dangers beyond mere wolves or bears. Willow ran through the forest with a speed and agility that belied her recent injury. Her fox-like senses guided her through shortcuts invisible to human eyes, allowing her to leap over fallen logs and navigate dense underbrush without slowing. The forest itself seemed to make way for her, branches bending just enough, roots lying flat rather than reaching to trip her feet. By twilight, the trees had thinned, giving way to the rocky foothills of the mountains. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of stone and snow from the higher elevations. Willow paused, catching her breath as she scanned the landscape, searching for the telltale signs Lucas had described. A cluster of birch trees near a small stream, where the blue moondrops would bloom once darkness fell. As night descended, she found her target, a secluded grove where slender birch trees stood like pale sentinels around a bubbling brook. And there, just as Lucas had promised, tiny flowers began to unfurl as the moon rose, their petals emitting a soft blue luminescence that painted the grove in ghostly light. Willow gathered them carefully, selecting only the fullest blooms and leaving enough that the plants would return the following year. But as she worked, a horrifying realization dawned on her. The village Lucas spoke of, the layout was achingly familiar now that she had seen more of it. The well in the center, the apple orchard to the east, the peculiar bend in the road leading to the shrine. It was Marrowvale. It was her village. The very place she had fled, where her own mother couldn't look her in the eye. Willow's hands trembled as she tied the bundle of glowing flowers. These children, the ones fighting for their lives, were the same ones who had once mocked her, called her beast and monster. Their parents had whispered behind her mother's back, claiming Willow was cursed, a bad omen. Some had even suggested her presence had brought illness and misfortune to Marrowvale in the past. For a moment, a dark thought crossed her mind. Let them suffer. Let them feel a fraction of the pain they had inflicted on her. Why should she help those who had only shown her cruelty? But then she remembered Lucas's words, "Healing is who I am, not what others think of me." She thought of his gentle hands tending the sick, despite having lost his father to human fear. She thought of the children, innocent despite their parents' prejudice. With renewed purpose, she gathered the flowers and raced back through the night, the blue glow of the moondrops lighting her path through the darkest parts of the forest. Dawn was breaking when she returned, exhausted but triumphant. Lucas, who had spent the night easing symptoms as best he could, looked up from the bedside of a small boy as she entered. Relief washed over his features. "You made it," he said, taking the flowers from her trembling hands. Their fingers brushed, and Willow felt a current pass between them, gratitude, admiration, and something deeper she wasn't ready to name. Lucas worked quickly, brewing the petals into a strong tea using the precise method his father had taught him. The resulting liquid glowed faintly blue in the early morning light, its aroma sharp yet not unpleasant. Together they moved from house to house, coaxing the fever-stricken children to drink the bitter remedy. Willow held small heads as Lucas administered the medicine, wiping sweaty brows and whispering encouragements. Some children were so weak they could barely swallow, requiring patience and care to ensure they received enough of the healing brew. In the last house, Willow froze in the doorway. The woman tending to the sick child was her mother, older now, worry lines etched deeply into her once smooth face. The recognition wasn't immediate. Willow's hood still concealed her most distinctive features, but there was a hesitation, a flicker of confused familiarity in her mother's eyes as she looked up. Lucas, sensing Willow's sudden tension, stepped forward. "We've brought medicine for the child," he said calmly, drawing the mother's attention. Willow approached slowly, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. The child in the bed was a little girl, no more than 6, with fiery red hair spread across the pillow, her cousin Marigold, who had been just a toddler when Willow left. Without a word, Willow knelt beside the bed, helping Lucas administer the medicine. The child's burning forehead gradually cooled under her touch. As the girl's breathing deepened into natural sleep, Willow felt her mother's gaze upon her, the weight of it almost physical. "Thank you," her mother whispered, her voice exactly as Willow remembered it, soft, with a slight musical lilt. "You and the healer, you've saved her." Willow nodded, not trusting herself to speak, But as she turned to leave, a breeze from the open window caught her hood, pushing it back just enough to reveal a glimpse of golden fur. Her mother's sharp intake of breath made Willow freeze. Willow? The name came out as a question, disbelief coloring every syllable. Slowly, inevitably, Willow turned back. Their eyes met fully for the first time in years, and something passed between them. Recognition, shock, and a tangle of emotions too complex to name. Willow couldn't speak. Her heart pounded in her chest, years of hurt threatening to spill over. But little Marigold stirred in her sleep, drawing Willow's attention back to the task at hand. The child's fever had broken, her cheeks already showing healthier color. "We should check on the others," Lucas said quietly, his hand a steadying presence on Willow's arm. "Make sure the medicine is working for everyone." Willow nodded gratefully, allowing him to lead her from the house, feeling her mother's gaze follow them until the door closed behind them. Hours later, as they sat exhausted outside the village well, Lucas finally asked, "This is your home, isn't it?" Willow nodded, watching as villagers moved about, casting curious glances their way. Word had spread that the healer's companion might be Willow, the fox girl who had disappeared days ago. "I never thought I'd return, especially not like this." "And now?" Lucas's question hung in the air between them, weighted with unspoken possibilities. Before she could answer, her mother approached, her steps hesitant. She stopped before Willow, eyes brimming with tears. The years had changed her. Silver threaded through her once auburn hair, and lines of hardship framed her mouth, but her eyes were the same warm brown Willow remembered. "You saved them," she said softly. "You saved our children." Willow stood, her emotions a tempest she could barely contain. "I didn't do it for recognition." Her mother reached out, her hand hovering inches from Willow's cheek. "I know. That's what makes you beautiful, my daughter. Not despite your differences, but because of who they've helped you become." Her voice broke. "I was weak. I let fear and the opinions of others come between us. I've regretted it every day since you left." The words Willow had longed to hear for years hung in the air between them. She felt Lucas's steady presence beside her, a reminder that she wasn't alone anymore. Slowly, deliberately, she reached up and pulled back her hood completely, revealing her golden ears. Gasps rippled through the gathered villagers, but she stood tall, unashamed for the first time in her life. "I'm not just your daughter," she said clearly. "I'm Willow, and this is who I am." Her mother enveloped her in a long overdue embrace, and something broken inside Willow began to heal. That evening, as they prepared to return to Lucas's cottage, the village elder approached them. He was an old man, stooped with age, the same one who had once been the loudest voice against Willow's presence. His white beard quivered as he cleared his throat. "Healer," he addressed Lucas, then turned to Willow with a respectful nod that she had never received from him before. "And Healer's assistant." The title, though simple, carried an acknowledgement Willow had never expected. "Our village would be honored if you would consider visiting more regularly, both of you." Lucas glanced at Willow, letting her decide. She thought of the cottage in the woods, the peace she had found there with Lucas. But she also thought of the children's faces as their fevers broke, of her mother's tears, of the possibility of building bridges where walls had once stood. "We'll come," she said finally. "Not because you need us, but because healing works both ways." As they walked back through the forest, the path now familiar under their feet, Lucas took her hand, his touch now a comfort. Willow welcomed rather than feared. "So," he said with a smile that reached his eyes, "healing is who you are too, it seems." Willow looked back at the village, then forward to the path ahead. For the first time, both directions held promise instead of pain. "I'm still figuring that out," she replied honestly. "But I think I'm ready to stop running." He squeezed her hand, and she felt the wildness in him call to the wildness in her, two halves of something unexpected but perfectly matched. "Good," Lucas said softly. "Because I've been waiting for someone like you my whole life." Above them, the stars emerged one by one, witnesses to a journey that had only just begun, a journey of healing, acceptance, and a love that transcended the boundaries that had once defined them. And somewhere in the forest depths, a fox's cry echoed. Not a sound of loneliness, but one of homecoming.